Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Gary. I'm going to be your host for the first couple of sessions today in Cisco's sponsor track session, so thank you all for coming. Hope you had a good lunch. I almost feel like I have to ask, so who here is from out of town? All right, I know. All right. We're going to get started today. A couple of just pieces of housekeeping before we get going on the first session. On the chairs when you came in, there was a little evaluation form for the speakers. If you could be so kind as to fill those out. We have a nice gift for you on the way out when you turn those in. The other thing is that Claire and Hannah, on your way in, we're passing out the Cisco code word cards for our little competition. Go to different Cisco activities throughout the course of the day. You'll get a different code word at each one. Collect, I think today is a minimum of 3. Take it back to the Cisco booth, and we've got a drawing for a really nice prize at the end of the day. So, and the code word for our session here is Multicloud, if I remember correctly. I'm getting nods and thumbs up from the back. So with that, I'm going to turn the session over to our presenter, Merv, who is a member of one of the local team here, and he has his session on model, deploy, and manage applications across your multi-cloud world. We're going to do a little Cloud Center talk, and with that, Merv.
Great, thanks, Gary. Appreciate it. All right, thanks, guys. I know it's hard, lunchtime and coming back after lunch, so hopefully it's going to be informational. What I'm going to do is probably not so much just product, but what our customers have done. So give you a bit of insight in terms of not just the product, what it can do, but what customers are actually using it for, right? So a couple of things I just want to talk about today is just the multi-cloud world, right? So what do we expect? How does it look like, right? So the next thing is application-centric modeling. So a lot of people deploy applications into one particular cloud or multiple clouds or a combination of hybrid clouds, right? And how do they actually deploy without having to worry about how the application actually sits, right? A lot of people consume a lot of services from the cloud, and they use those services. I mean, it's easy to spin up, but it becomes so diluted that each of these are different to particular clouds. So you have particular Jenkins on AWS will be different again to Azure. The way that they actually provision, and it kind of, how do you actually make it heterogeneous? How do you actually deploy it from, consistency, be able to migrate between clouds as well when you need to. And a centralized management, right? How do you actually view all the clouds that you're consuming resources from, not just from the infrastructure, but application-wise across the board. And then I'm going to run a demo. So the demo is going to be depending on the network. So if the network's good, I'm going to run a live one. Otherwise, I'm going to flip over to a video. So hopefully the demo gods are good. So multi-cloud world, what does it mean, right? So I'm not the one in the picture there. But anyway, so it is a lot of cloud there. So most of you here might have interactions with one or many of these clouds. And it becomes quite confusing, right? Which cloud does what better? Before there was less choices, where you have Amazon with open source and then Azure with .NET development or Microsoft development. But now they're kind of like grayed out. Even Microsoft is embracing Linux, for example. So it gets quite tough for customers to decide. But not just that. When we look at how you actually take your applications, all your business requirements in terms of delivered by applications, and then map that to the numerous clouds. So I'm not talking about just public cloud, private cloud, your own data center, right? Things like managed services, right? A lot of people miss that. So you have, soft layers, for example, or IBM Blue, in terms of managed services. So a lot of these don't really match up, right? IBM might have soft layer services, and you have different catalog items for Azure, Amazon, Google, Alibaba, you name it, right? But as soon as we start mapping it, it becomes very expensive. Cost goes up, right? When I say cost goes up, is the actual development time, right? Every time I talk to a customer, they go, oh, we've just hired an Azure specialist. We're using Amazon, we've got an Amazon specialist. And that's where I see the analogy of getting silos kind of built, right? So if I need something on Azure, I would talk to the Azure specialist. And companies are spending a lot of investment in these people that are experts. But at the end of the day, they're still paying Azure, Amazon, Google, the subscription, right, for using the infrastructure. But they all start to think that I need the expert. I need to know every single service. I need to map it to my business. And a lot of times they find that they might be able to map maybe 70%, 30%, but not everything, right? So how do you actually make sense out of it? And Cisco has actually provided a solution for that. But let's look at two intractable problems, right? Cloud management is infrastructure focused. A lot of people approach it as if it was a VM, right? So, I mean, in an actual sense it is, right? But it's managed the same way as they manage private cloud, which is slightly different because costing is different, right? You can't say here's a VM and the face value of VM. You don't actually address the actual cost, how long the actual virtual machine sits. Things like aging, all right, or leasing of virtual machines. Private cloud doesn't really matter. I mean, I've seen administrators going around trying to recover VMs every 3 months and say, hey, we're running a sprawl. But you can't really treat that from a public cloud perspective, right? And the other thing is application is always left on the side, right? Yes, we can actually talk to Google. We can actually provision into Amazon. We have the tool sets, but application deployment is always missed, right? How do we actually get code out there? And developers running CI/CD. And a classic one is one of the financial institutions that has actually chosen Cloud Center as the choice of cloud broker, is that they actually have development teams that go out and go to the managed service provider. It takes about 49 days to get infrastructure, right? So a lot of them split up. They go out to Amazon, to Google, and they get their resources, and they use those resources. But a lot of times, the delay, right? And I asked them, do you do CI/CD? And they go, we try to. But I said, have you done it? Have you reached that CI/CD, being able to automate everything? And a lot of times they come back and say, no, not quite yet, right? We have the tool set, we have the scripts, we have the code, but the target environment's always a delay, right? And I can't imagine asking for a second environment, a third environment. 49 days, multiply, it all stacks up, right? So a lot of them use stale environments. And as you know, CI/CD is rapid deployment, right? We want to deploy fresh with the actual code and actually have it up and running for development or testing or the next cycle, right? The other thing is clouds are all different, right? As I mentioned before, right? Even the APIs are different, right? So no one's going in and actually said, I'm going to go and build an API across all of them. You see Amazon do kind of like Azure. You have Google kind of trying to do Amazon. But when you look at Alibaba Cloud, that's another one in the mix, right? There's going to be more coming as well. Choices, even local cloud providers like Dimension Data, Telstra, for example, they all have different APIs, right? So with those two kind of big questions in here is that we've got IT running around going, yes, we manage the cloud now, but hang on, you deploy your old application. And then you have all the cloud providers going, yeah, we do support the other cloud, but maybe one or two. So what's the actual answer, right? So Cisco's looked at the situation and kind of look at why can't you model once and deploy to any cloud, right? What is it so tough to actually do that, right? So what Cisco has done is actually provided the capability to model your application once, right? So whether it's a WordPress, MongoDB, depending on what 2-tier, 3-tier stack, and be able to take infrastructure provisioning as well and provision it out. Doesn't matter which cloud, right? So Plus Center supports up to 19 plus different clouds, right? So let's look at how we actually do it, right? So a couple of things is providing that central management to model, first, to build your application. Second, to actually deploy to a target cloud, using our orchestrators, and then manage it. So things like power on, power off, right? Costing, for example, leasing, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. So when we look at application-centric modeling, right? So what have people done in the past, right, or are still doing, is, as I mentioned, the SMEs would start coding towards Amazon scripting, right, or cloud formations for deployment, and then you have OpenStack doing scripts as well, and then Microsoft with their deployment tools, right? So each of them have got silos, and a lot of times the development team gets into those silos, right? Because developers' background is more Amazon or OpenStack or Azure, and they start consuming just those services. But the business on the top level is going, hang on, I can't get consistency. when, can I actually deploy an application to a target cloud when I need to, when I want to, and the cost is low, right? Can I use that capability? There isn't at the moment. So what Cloud Center does is actually lets you model the application once, but decide to deploy across different clouds. And when I say deploy, we call the clouds environments. So you can say Google is a development environment, Amazon could be a UAT, and then private cloud as a production, right? So we can actually classify that and do the role-based access and tenancy to let customers deploy it. But let's have a look at what is an actual application profile, right? So in Cloud Center Sense, application profile is your stack, right? So in this case, it's NGIX, Apache, and MySQL, right? Simple three-tier stack, right? So what we do is the cube on the right is actually the representation of how we actually package it up in a profile, right? So the next thing is choices, right? Standards, small, medium, large, governance, for example. Third is, containers, right? Whether it's Kubernetes, Docker, container, or, ACI from Cisco. Your scripts, your jar files, your WAR files, your binaries that actually push out. And that's part of our profile, right? So the other knobs is like, where do we deploy it to? So that makes up an actual application profile. It's not just here's code, Jenkins does that as well. We can actually do the collaborative deployment. But what we do is we package the actual infrastructure. Now, the secret sauce is the actual orchestrator, right? Being able to target multiple clouds without having the full knowledge of understanding that particular target cloud. So when we look at an application profile, right? So a couple of things that I brought up is providing that application topology, drag and drop, right? Once you build your application and your code, we consume your own repositories. So we don't make you code in Cloud Center coding. There is no such thing as Cloud Center coding. So what we do is we sequence it and let you provision not just the infrastructure, the network, the storage, but the application on top of it as well, right? And when we look at the profile, so we take a profile and the Cloud Center manager decides based on governance rules to push it out to an orchestrator, right? So the orchestrator is where it talks out to a particular cloud. Right, so Amazon, Google, but in actual technical terms, the orchestrator is the same OVF or AMI, whichever you choose. And that's actually the same engine, but we dedicated that for a particular cloud for the workload. So that's why I say the cloud manager takes a profile of like a three-tier app, passes the orchestrator talks to the target cloud, whether it's private, hybrid, or your Amazons or Googles. So what makes it easy, in terms of heterogeneous deployment is the capability of each orchestrator that we target out to the cloud to be able to understand the infrastructure, right? If you look at it, it's not rocket science. We are doing mapping to the AMIs in Amazon. We're doing Google instances mapping, right? But it lets you take control of what an AMI size equals to a my business small, medium, large, for example. So when I actually have that in hand, I can now model and say, for developers, they can never go past medium, right? Or for this big data project, they need to go large, right? So now I can adjust and tweak based on that requirement. But having those orchestrator eliminates a lot of those issues from hiring an expert. Now you can consume the cloud with a simple account, and the target is your cloud of choice. So the other thing is enterprise class is we have UI, so you can actually drive it, drag and drop, build your application profile, but there's CLI and APIs as well. So when I talk about APIs, it's how we actually integrate with the dev toolchain, right? Your Jenkins, for example, Artifactory, your GitHub, right? And I'm going to talk a little bit about it next slide, is being able to have that extensiveness to actually trigger from Jenkins to provision the next environment, right? When we look at CI/CD, is like be able to take code from Artifactory, GitHub, for example, or your own personal repository, and actually push it out into when someone checks the code in, right? So as a normal sequence, I check in code. Next thing is I need an environment to actually test the code. If the code actually succeeds, it doesn't break any other code, I'm going to make it the next release. That simple cycle sometimes could take days to weeks, right? If you can actually model that application once, I can take that, deploy to any cloud I need to, For that duration, maybe it could be 10, 15 minutes to run the test script, drop the instance, come back to Jenkins and say, successful. Next coder, check in your code. So you could be doing this 40, 50 times a day. And a lot of issues is that people kind of always narrow down to one particular cloud or their private infrastructure. Yes, you can script that, automate it, but you have so many choices, right? It could be cheaper in public cloud for that 15 minutes rather than getting my infrastructure guys to carve up storage and have it private cloud. So it's really up to you, right? Having that flexibility is quite important. So other things like calling in from a self-service catalog, right? So for this financial institution I'm talking about, is they're using ServiceNow, it could be Remedy, for example, to actually call the catalogs within Cloud Center to deploy an application. So you have your application managers that provide that capability, and you can have different teams model their own applications as well. So it's tenanted to that sense that you can actually say, I can still keep doing my own development with my own tool sets and my own repositories. I don't want to share it because it's a high-profile project. You can still model it within Cloud Center, right? So obviously with the hooks, with being able to launch scripts and events, tie into SSO, single sign-on, for example, tie into IPAM that you have or DNS requirements. So I'll walk you through how the orchestrator actually works. This is quite interesting, right? So from a application profile, the same image that you saw on the far left. So we're putting it through the orchestrator, and that profile will be the complete profile for how we deploy the application, right? So firstly, provision infrastructure, right? So I'm going to stand up the 3-tier stack, for example, and then I'm going to put agents on, right? So Cloud Center agent on the target, and what we do is with that agent, we secure that communication to your repository, Artifactory, for example. So we pull that code in, and we actually deploy and orchestrate, right? Lock it, firewall rules or network rules or ACI integration, for example, or vCenter or Amazon VPCs, and be able to lock that, and not only lock it, but monitor and trigger runs. So when I say monitor is look at the status, right? What's the health of the VMs, right? We do that collection to get costing as well. And the other thing is trigger on runtime. So when I actually have a web server hitting 80%, I want to be able to add another web server and then configure the load balancer with that second web server. So this is where all the flexibility is there. When I fire it off, I can preset that and say, deploy and scale out up to 5, but send me an email if it's number 6, right? Don't deploy number 6. But as it goes, I can still keep hitting it with my testing tools, or developers can actually still do their development, and it'll automatically scale out. So you don't have to worry about that 2 o'clock call saying, can you deploy another infrastructure or another VM? Add it to the network team and say, can you add it to the F5 load balancer, for example. So we do that in Cloud Center. So centralized management, right? So in terms of being able to manage costs, a lot of people kind of look at it and go, yep, we've got a ELA or we've signed a contract with Amazon, so we don't have to worry about cost. But where I see today's cloud is going to be interesting in probably the next 12, 18 months is there's going to be providers that come in, and especially, I'm not naming, but Alibaba is a good one, where they could actually say, here's a prepaid card, right? So I like to use the analogy of mobile phones, right? When you look at 5, 6 years ago, mobile phones was you choose a provider, you sign up for 24 months, and you sat there hoping you've chosen the right provider, right? And the problem about moving in the next 24 months after your contract was porting your number. It could take days, weeks, and somehow the number goes missing. So when I look at that and compare that to now, mobile phones, you go into Woolworths or any of the shopping centers, you can buy a prepaid card. 30 days, 6 gigs of data, port it across your number in like 10, 15 minutes, right? So I would see cloud to be easy to consume, right? So it is now easy to consume, but I think it's going to be easier. It's going to be like the prepaid. But with a lot of customers get scripting, they use specific cloud tools, they get stuck, right? So what if Google offers a 6-month special, right? 50 VMs for X amount of price, cheaper than any cloud out there. Can you actually leverage that? A lot of people kind of go, hey, maybe we should look at Google. Next thing, Amazon's going to have that special. So I think the market's going to be quite challenging, but whether you're ready to actually migrate, and a lot of customers are still having that dilemma of, hey, I've got my applications running on Amazon, that multiple availability zones, and I get a hit, right? So I got to move my DR somewhere else. So that's where people kind of look at it and go, hang on, why do I have to have my DR on another availability zone? Can I have my DR on a separate cloud, totally, with different SLAs? That's your choice, right? With Cloud Center, we provide that. The other thing is application leasing, right? Being able to lease applications to a particular group of people, right? So developers could run projects for 6 months. Why let them keep the virtual machine or instance for like 12, right? So you actually set maybe 8 months if they run the projects for 6, and then you actually auto-terminate the stack, right? So it makes it easier to manage. Rather than go and beg for the resources back, you actually set and actually let them know you can't keep it past that. Automatically, they get emails. They can come back and renew it if they have to. But environments should be refreshed as fast as you can, right? The other thing is scale in and out application tier. I touched a little bit on that, is being able to say, here's my stack, right? I want to be able to automatically scale out my web server or application server as it hits a particular percentage. So as we do the monitor on the instances, we actually check that. And we trigger and say, hey, it's as easy. I'm going to roll out my code. It's going to be a web server, for example, added to the load balancer because I understand the stack. I built the stack, right? Upgrade applications is a real challenge. Being able to roll out code to an environment when it's on the fly, right? So you've deployed an environment, developer comes in, hang on, there's something issue with that. We need to actually upgrade that application, right? Or security vulnerability. A lot of times you have to inject that in the code, right? So if you build that code and it's complete within a short time, trying to deploy that to the target is also a bit of a hit and miss, right? Where is it? How many environments do I have? Has that dev team actually consumed a public cloud? You don't know. So by having that centralized management, you have the full visibility. How many of these stacks are deployed? Which cloud's actually hosting it? How much does it cost? When is it going to end of lease in terms of reclaiming those resources, right? And the final one that I'll show in the demo is the benchmark applications, right? How many times have you thought about it and say, I've got an application, but is it going to cost me more if I run it on Amazon or cost me less if I run it on Google, right? A lot of people don't have that answer, and they struggle, right? A lot of people try because it's actually one of the largest projects in financial institution is to figure out what is the best performance versus price, right? And you have the choice of so many clouds out there. How do you actually do it? And I'll show you an actual solution itself. A bit of sleeping music. Okay. So hopefully, and again, if the network holds up, I will run the live demo. Give me a sec. Okay, all right. No. Okay, so this is Cloud Center. I've just logged in. And initially, when you look at it, the dashboard actually tells you a wealth of information. So cloud cost, right? I've got multiple clouds here. I've got Amazon, I've got VMware, Azure, OpenStack, Google, a whole list, and different regions as well, right? All managed through here. So I can see the runtime cost, right, in terms of hours, running VMs across all clouds, my usage plan, if I'm actually an end user logging in, my cloud status, right, whether the region's up or down, recent deployments that I did, favorite deployments that my team actually rolled out. And you can see usage by cloud over time, right, in terms of which region is more popular. And I can now tweak it and say, hey, let's move the workload across because now there's a special on, for example, as I mentioned, right, in Google. Let's move all my next new deployments into there and then ship back when I need to, right? And VM usage by application over time, all right? So a lot of rich information here. But when we look at application profile, and as I mentioned, and how we actually build it, it's quite simple, right? So if I go into model and look at how I would build a new application model, it's all UI-based drag and drop, right? So when I go in, I have a choice of, do I want just a batch execute? So I can call Puppet, for example. Do I want parallel executes? I can call Puppet N Chef, for example, or I can go into my N-tier execution and start to model my 3-tier app, or 2-tier app, depending on your requirements. So in here, what I could do is I can firstly go in, okay, I need a load balancer. So everything is laid out on the left here. And again, these can be built by our customers. So we have out-of-the-box solutions or support in terms of capability. So ACI support, for example, ELB support. But it could be your own, right? So in this case, let's say I want a HA proxy in front, right? So drag and drop that across. Now I want to go in my web server and say put an Apache in there, right? And I want to hook up the HA proxy to my Apache. And then I want finally a database. Well, this is the requirement for the application, right? So I'm going to go in and say MySQL, drag and drop there, and connect it up. Now, here's where I spoke about how do we actually add nodes, right? So I can go in here and say 2. And I've got 2 nodes, right? So this is a web server, 2 web servers under HA proxy with MySQL in the backend, right? And I can say maximum number of nodes. So now I can trigger it to automatically grow that up to, let's say, 5, right? So start with 2, maximum 5. And I can actually model this, and you can see based on each of these boxes, I can start configuring where is my repository? Where am I pointing to get that binary, my zip file, my code, right, my configuration? So you can actually point that and build it. And we have so many insertion points where you can say, I can have external initialization, set up firewall rules in here, deploy parameters if I want user interaction, for example, like database passwords, minimum hardware specs. This is where we don't want someone to deploy a 3-tier stack with a web server that is too low in terms of resources that could cause issues, right? Environment variables, right? No initialization cleanup. So once I've deployed it, how do I clean up? Migration. How do I migrate from one cloud to the other cloud? How do I back up certain code or data and then redeploy it to another target cloud? And also, how do we upgrade? Again, we can point to your existing repositories to actually do that. All right. So I'm going to go and deploy into OpenStack, and I'll show you how a deployment actually steps through, right, when we actually select the deployment. So I'm going to select WordPress, and I'm going to go deploy. So when we go through the deploy, a couple of things you need to fill in, and it's quite simple. We can put governance rules on it and have minimal flexibility, or we can actually have very open in terms of what they choose. All right, so OpenStack Summit 09, and this is the tags that we say, okay, we want to use a demo environment, or you can choose production, right, Azure, a particular target cloud. So I'm going to use demo, right, so that's going to go and evaluate, and once it comes back, I can see all the parameters, right, MySQL, Apache, and here I can actually choose to have a different tag. If you're doing hybrid cloud, for example, having the web server in Amazon and maybe application server private cloud in VMware, you can actually do that. So I can say select a different tag for my Apache, right? But I'm just going to leave it as it is, and by selecting demo, I get OpenStack as a choice, right? So in here, I can go in and say, okay, what's this M1 small, right? So I'm going to map to that. And again, I can actually choose, if allowed, Apache sizing, right, and SQL sizing, right? And then I go ahead and say deploy. So when we deploy, that's going to probably take about 8-10 minutes, but I won't go through the whole thing. But the users actually see step by step each of those nodes, what we're deploying to, in terms of scripts, code, for example, and you can troubleshoot from the actual console itself. All right. So I'm going to wait for that to go away, and then I'm going to show you a couple of things, and then we'll close up. Okay, so I spoke about a few things, but one of the things I want to show you is benchmarking. So if we go into benchmarks, so I can take a WordPress or any applications that are model, and I can push it out to a particular cloud. In this case, I've already got one done, and I'm going to show you what a benchmark actually means, right? So when I benchmark, I'm taking different sizings on my application, and I'm deploying to the target cloud, and I'm running a Java load test. on the web server. I can run a Java load test on the database. And then what I do is I bring the results back from different clouds and different combinations of sizing and give you a comparison, right? So in this case, if you look at it, it's going to be best price performance, Amazon US East. Best performance, Amazon US East. But best price is a medium in Amazon East, right? So you can see, based on the load test, and you can run this every day, every week. And this report will come back and say, we can scale back. We don't need that heavy resource that you host the application. Now it gives you a more informed decision on what applications fit best for which cloud and save costs for the company. Right, so the main thing here is visibility. So what I'll do is I'll switch back in a couple of things I think Gary mentioned already, but so what we do is we actually take cloud in general and your data center and put it together into what we call heterogeneous, right? So we let you actually deploy applications to the target without having the nuances of learning each of those platforms, right? Having the automation all built in. And a couple of things is, just to rephrase, is the code word competition today for my session is multi-cloud. So write that down. There's going to be check 1. So there's 2 more sessions. If you go to those, you will get the keyword as well. And hopefully you get a nice prize. I don't even know what the prize is, so don't ask me. Any questions before we kind of close? Yes.
Yeah, we have about...
Just hang on for a sec.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hang on
Sorry,
for a sec.
Moving applications within VMs with the associated data, correct, into various clouds. The data stores that you're moving, when you move those VMs, do you compress the data? What about the technologies behind it? How do you make it space efficient? How does that work?
So one of the things that we don't do is actually migrate the data. Oh. So just to be clear, we're deploying the same stack, your application, your code, right, and we rely on the customers to do it. I mean, just a bit of insight, it's not a Cisco product, but we work with NetApp, for example. They have ONTAP Cloud, right, which does the replication between your local data center and an image in Amazon, for example. So you can actually say, do that switch, and Cloud Center can actually reattach the data and mount it up. So you have your applications now talking to the data. So there is no secret sauce in terms of you have 2 terabytes, we take it across automatically.
Actually, I'm glad I brought that up, so I work for NetApp.
Yes, that's a good question.
That wasn't the reason why I brought it up. Okay, but the other part I want to talk about is microsegmentation. So will you provide microsegmentation with these apps if you're using ACI? Is that also part of...
Correct. So the multi-pod, so if you look at ACI, or come to the next, later, the 3rd session, which you talk about NFV, and extending to the multi-cloud, that will give you a lot of answers in that session. But yes, we are automating ACI in terms of creating endpoint groups, contracts, and building from scratch a tenant.
And can you roll back? So let's suppose you put something forward and it could be an error somewhere, or you've changed, the situation changed. Can you roll back everything, all the functions?
Yes,
including the network?
Yes, because we sequence it, we know exactly how to actually roll back.
Okay.
So we can tear down the whole environment once the development cycle is done.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. Sorry, I'll grab the mic.
We have probably time for this last question.
Yes.
And then we can take Q&A out in the hall.
Yes. I'll be available outside, so.
So my question is this the multi-cloud solution public service of Cisco, or it is a software product?
At the moment, it is subscription priced and it's on-prem, right? Now, on-prem as in your own data center, right? So it's not a SaaS. Subscription means you buy by 1, 3, or 5 years in terms of licensing, right? But it's actually hosted, and some customers actually want to put the cloud center manager in AWS. We're not stopping you. So your developers can access it from the public. But typically, you can actually take that and actually put it in your vCenter, Hyper-V, for example, and run the whole management stack there. Right? But it's subscription-based.